I am Joshua, 32 years old, and my entire family flew 15 states over for my brother's unborn twins' gender reveal. But a month later, not a single one of them showed up at my wedding. Before I tell you how they entirely destroyed their own lives by making that choice, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The glaring Pacific sun beat down heavily on my shoulders as I stood on the periphery of a lavish, rented beachfront cabana in Malibu, California. It was the second Saturday in June, the kind of aggressively perfect summer day that usually only exists in travel brochures. The air smelled strongly of expensive coconut sunscreen, sea salt, and the catered garlic butter shrimp that servers were passing around on silver trays. My entire extended family was there. My parents, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and half a dozen cousins had joyfully coordinated flights, traveling all the way from the humid, sticky suburbs of New Jersey to the pristine coast of Southern California. The occasion was my older brother Julian and his wife Isabella's gender reveal party. To call it a party is an understatement. It was a spectacle of sheer, unadulterated excess. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for this monumental event. They funded first-class tickets for themselves, securing luxury oceanfront hotel suites for all the extended relatives who made the trip. My mother even hired a professional event planner from Beverly Hills, a woman with an earpiece who buzzed around coordinating the catered food and the massive balloon arches. The entire display culminated in a rented helicopter flying low over the water, dropping massive amounts of biodegradable pink and blue confetti into the ocean while a hired string quartet played pop covers directly on the sand. I watched my father, a man who routinely and loudly complained about the physical toll of his mild arthritis back home, practically sprint through the sand to get a better camera angle of the helicopter. My mother had spent 3 solid weeks agonizing over the perfect designer pastel outfit to wear for the professional photographer, constantly texting our family group chat about which shade of mint green looked best on her. I had also made the trip, but my experience was completely different. I had quietly purchased my own economy ticket, sitting in the middle seat near the back of the plane, and booked a modest, slightly damp Airbnb a few miles inland. I did this because I still harbored the naive, exhausting illusion that showing up for my family, being the good, reliable son, would eventually result in them showing up for me. I spent the entire afternoon observing them from the edge of the cabana. I watched my parents fawn over Julian and Isabella. Julian is a man whose manufactured charm barely conceals his towering arrogance. He walked around holding a glass of vintage champagne, wearing a custom linen suit, loudly talking about his tech startup. Anyone listening would think he was the next Steve Jobs. I knew the truth. His deeply precarious financial reality was a ticking time bomb, but my parents treated him like royalty. Isabella, rubbing her their baby bump, complained about how tiring the ocean breeze was, and my mother rushed over with a silk shawl. I stood near the catering table, drinking a warm club soda, entirely ignored. No one asked about my flight. No one asked about my upcoming wedding. It was in that exact moment, watching the confetti settle on the waves, that I finally understood the truth. The hierarchy within my family was not a temporary phase. It was a permanent, unalterable institution. Julian was the golden child. I was just the audience they required to witness his greatness. Exactly 4 weeks and 6 days after that sun-drenched, incredibly expensive spectacle in Malibu, the absolute consequences of their arrogance finally caught up to them. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting on the wide, shaded back porch of my home, a heavy ceramic cup of black coffee in my hand. The neighborhood was profoundly quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves of the ancient oak trees in my backyard. I was finally at peace. Then, the heavy oak table vibrated. My phone screen lit up. It was a text from my mother. 5 seconds later, the phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Julian's name. I did not answer. I simply watched it ring out. 10 seconds after that, my father called. Then Aunt Susan. Then Uncle Aaron. Within exactly 10 minutes, my phone began to violently detonate. It was a relentless, vibrating assault. The screen lit up over and over again, refusing to go dark. I watched the notification counter climb rapidly. 10, 50, 100. It finally stopped at 215. 215 incoming calls, frantic text messages, and breathless, panicked voicemails flooded my device from every single person who shared my last name. I did not pick up. I did not feel a single spike of anxiety. I did not panic. I simply watched the screen glow, took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, and felt an overwhelming sense of justice. The foundations of their fairy tale world, the fake, heavily mortgaged reality they had built around Julian, had just been completely shattered into a million irreversible pieces. And I knew exactly why. I knew where Julian had been that morning. I knew whose office he had confidently walked into, and I knew exactly whose face he saw sitting across the boardroom table. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic mistake they made, and the absolute beautiful justice of what happened in that corporate boardroom 34 days after my wedding, we have to go back. We have to look at the ledger of love they kept for my entire life. We have to look at the exact moments they taught me that family is just a word people use to manipulate you. Growing up in our large, meticulously decorated house in New Jersey, the rules were never explicitly spoken aloud, but they were deeply and painfully understood. Julian was the investment. I was the safety net. Every single achievement of mine was met with a polite, distracted nod, while every minor, expected milestone of Julian's was treated like a national holiday. I learned early on to keep my head down. I got excellent grades, I stayed out of trouble, and I didn't ask for much. I thought that being low maintenance, being the son who didn't cause stress, would eventually earn their respect and love. Instead, it just made me completely invisible. The clearest, most painful memory I have of this dynamic, the moment that truly defined my financial and emotional independence, happened when I was 18 years old. I had worked part-time at a local hardware store for 3 grueling years. I swept floors, stocked heavy shelves, and saved every single penny because I knew university was going to be expensive. My parents had also set up a college fund for both Julian and me when we were babies. It wasn't a massive, life-changing amount, but it was enough to cover my tuition at a solid in-state school, so I wouldn't graduate drowning in debt. A week before my freshman year started, Julian graduated from his wildly expensive private college. He moved back home and immediately started complaining. He loudly claimed that driving his old, reliable Honda to job interviews was embarrassing for a man entering the high-stakes corporate world. He said he needed to project success to achieve it. I walked into the kitchen one Tuesday evening, still wearing my dusty work boots, and found my parents sitting at the dining table with a stack of banking documents. My father looked up at me, cleared his throat, and used his best businessman voice. "Joshua," he said, not making eye contact, "we need to discuss family finances. We've had to reallocate some family assets." I asked him what he meant. My mother chimed in, smiling that fake, practice smile. "Well, darling, your brother needs a reliable, impressive vehicle for his new career. We decided to use your college fund to put the down payment on a brand new BMW for him as a graduation gift. You're smart, Joshua. You can take out some student loans. Julian needs this to secure his future. It's about protecting the family inheritance down the line." They looked at me as if this was a perfectly logical business decision. They acted as if Julian was securing the family legacy, while I was just an unnecessary expense. My chest tightened, and my throat burned, but I didn't yell. I realized right then that crying or arguing would only make them call me selfish. I went to the bank the next morning and signed the paperwork for high-interest student loans. I picked up night shifts at a 24-hour diner to pay for my textbooks, smelling like old grease during my morning lectures. I never complained to them again. I just swallowed the bitter pill, locked away my expectations, and kept moving forward in the dark. Years later, after building a quiet but incredibly stable life for myself, I met Harper. Harper was different from anyone in my family, and vastly different from the flashy, loud women Julian usually dated. She was quiet, meticulously observant, and deeply grounded. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. She dressed entirely in unbranded, high-quality earth tones, simple linen shirts, tailored trousers, no massive designer logos. She drove a 5-year-old, incredibly reliable sedan that she kept perfectly clean. When things got serious, I brought her home to introduce her to my parents and Julian at our annual Thanksgiving dinner. The judgment in the room the moment we walked through the door was thick enough to cut with a carving knife. My family took one look at her simple, understated clothes, glanced out the window at her older car parked next to Julian's leased Mercedes, and immediately dismissed her. They collectively assumed she was a mundane administrative worker who perfectly matched my supposedly mundane life. During dinner, they asked her almost no questions. When my father finally addressed her, he spoke slowly, as if she couldn't understand complex concepts. "So, Harper," he said, carving the turkey, "Joshua tells us you work in an office in the city. Must be nice to have a stable 9-to-5 desk job with a predictable salary. Not like Julian here, who is building an empire." Harper didn't flinch. She just smiled politely, her eyes sparkling with a secret amusement I would later come to understand. "It keeps me busy," she replied smoothly. They showed zero interest in her background. They patronized her with the exact same condescending politeness they reserved for waiters and valet drivers. After dinner, Aunt Susan, wearing a heavy, gaudy diamond necklace, pulled me aside into the hallway near the coats. She looked at me with a face full of fake pity, lowered her voice, and whispered, "Joshua, sweetheart, she seems nice, but aren't you settling? With your modest salary, I suppose you can't afford a high-maintenance woman like Isabella, but you really shouldn't bring down the family standard. Julian is doing so well. You should try to be more ambitious." I felt my jaw clench. A vein throbbed in my temple. I looked past Aunt Susan's heavily powdered face, toward the living room. Harper was standing near the fireplace, admiring a painting. She caught my eye in the hallway mirror. I knew, without a doubt, that she had heard every single word Aunt Susan said. But Harper didn't look angry. She didn't storm out or demand an apology. She just offered me a small, incredibly mysterious smile, raised her water glass slightly in my direction, and took a sip. I never corrected my family's assumptions about her that night. Harper never defended herself either. We both understood in that moment that their total lack of curiosity was a symptom of their own massive self-absorption. They only saw what they wanted to see, and what they desperately wanted to see was a version of me that was infinitely inferior to Julian. Letting them believe their own delusions was the best armor we had. The true, absolute test of their loyalty came when Harper and I decided to get married. We didn't want a massive, flashy circus. We planned a beautiful, intimate ceremony at a private estate in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. It was exactly a 2-hour and 15-minute drive from my parents' house in New Jersey. It was a straight shot down the interstate through familiar, easy terrain. No flights required. No hotels needed unless they wanted to stay. We sent out the elegant, understated invitations 6 months in advance. 50 wooden chairs were carefully arranged on the left side of the aisle, designated specifically for my family. Exactly 3 days before the wedding, my phone rang. I was in my living room, finalizing the catering menu. It was my mother. The moment I answered, her voice dripped with that specific, practiced tone of superficial regret that people use when they have already absolved themselves of any guilt. "Joshua, darling," she sighed heavily into the receiver, making sure I could hear how exhausted she was. "We have a bit of a situation. Your father's back is just acting up terribly. And honestly, after all that exhausting travel to California last month for Julian's gender reveal, we are just entirely drained. The drive to Pennsylvania is simply going to be too taxing for us." I froze. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I stared at the wall, processing the massive, astronomical hypocrisy of her statement. "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously low, "it is a 2-hour drive. You flew across the entire country for a party announcing the gender of babies that haven't even been born yet. But a 2-hour drive to see your son get married is an insurmountable physical hardship. Please don't be difficult, Joshua," she reprimanded me. effortlessly shifting the blame with the practiced ease of a career narcissist. Isabella's pregnancy is high risk, and we needed to be there to support Julian. A wedding is just a party. We'll send a nice check, but you really shouldn't be so selfish as to demand we put your father's health at risk for a 2-hour car ride. She hung up before I could say another word. I stood there, staring at the blank screen, my throat tight. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from my best friend and groomsman, Elijah. He followed my family on social media. It was a screenshot from Instagram, posted publicly just 30 minutes ago by my Uncle Aaron. The photo showed my father, wearing crisp white golf clothes, holding a titanium golf club, and smiling broadly on a pristine, sun-drenched green. The caption read, "Kicking off the exclusive weekend charity tournament with the boys. Let's go." My father's back looked perfectly fine. They weren't staying home to rest. They were actively choosing a weekend golf tournament over my wedding. By the end of that day, the rest of my family had conveniently formulated their own miraculously synchronized excuses. The dominoes fell exactly as I expected them to. Uncle Aaron called and left a brief, upbeat voicemail claiming he had sudden, terrible car trouble and couldn't make it out of town. I knew for a fact he had a brand new, fully warranted SUV sitting in his driveway. Aunt Susan sent a text message, not even a phone call, saying she had caught a terrible summer cold and didn't want to risk infecting our guests. Cousin after cousin suddenly had scheduling conflicts. It became glaringly, painfully obvious that a collective decision had been made in their group chats. My wedding simply did not warrant their effort. I didn't have the status, the wealth, or the manufactured drama of Julian, so I wasn't worth the gas money. When the morning of the wedding finally arrived, I stood in the groom's suite, looking at my reflection in the tall vanity mirror. Outside, the venue staff was setting up the 50 chairs on the left side of the aisle. I knew every single one of those chairs would remain completely and utterly empty. But as I looked at myself, adjusting my tie, a strange thing happened. I did not cry. I didn't throw my phone across the room, and I didn't succumb to the crushing weight of their rejection. I realized that the grief of losing my family had already been processed 1,000 times over during my childhood. When they drained my college fund, when they ignored me at dinners, when they mocked the woman I loved. What was left in the wake of that grief was a profound, crystalline clarity. Attempting to extract unconditional love from people who view affection as a currency to be spent exclusively on those who enhance their social standing is a fool's errand. They thought my modest salary and quiet life were beneath them. They thought they were punishing me. I smoothed the lapels of my suit. I took a deep breath, walked out of that room, and accepted the absolute fact that the family I was born into had just voluntarily, permanently severed the cord. And they were completely unaware of the monumental miscalculation they had just made regarding the quiet woman I was about to marry. The ceremony took place in the spectacular terrace gardens of the estate, under a massive canopy of ancient willow trees. When I had originally sent my mother the address months ago, she did a quick internet search, saw no commercial hotel listings or country club memberships attached to the name, and dismissively assumed it was some budget-friendly public park. She had even made a snide comment about hoping it wouldn't rain on our little picnic. She was entirely, catastrophically wrong. The magnificent private estate where we were currently getting married, the place she deemed not worth a 2-hour drive, was actually Harper's own property. It was a sweeping, pristine 70-acre sanctuary that she maintained with quiet, understated pride. We had intentionally kept the details of our financial and professional realities entirely concealed from my family. It wasn't out of malice, but out of a shared, absolute boundary of self-preservation. I knew exactly how my parents operated. If they had known the true extent of Harper's wealth, their entirely absent interest in me would have violently transformed. They would have launched an obsessive, suffocating campaign to leverage her money for their own social elevation, and more importantly, to fund Julian's endless financial demands. They would have paraded her at country club dinners and harassed us for loans. As I walked out onto the terrace and stood at the altar, I consciously refused to let my gaze drift toward the 50 empty wooden chairs on the left side of the lawn. I focused entirely on Harper as she walked down the aisle. She looked breathtaking, radiating a calm, commanding grace. As she reached me and we joined hands, the soft summer breeze blew across the lawn. In the distance, at the edge of the manicured property, the doors to the main garage had been left slightly ajar by the catering staff bringing in supplies. Inside, out of the direct glare of the sun, sat Harper's daily driver. It wasn't the 5-year-old sedan she drove when visiting my parents. That old car was just a shield. Sitting in the garage was a sleek, jet-black Porsche 911, polished to a mirror finish, a silent testament to the empire she had built. The reception that followed was a masterpiece of culinary excellence and genuine, unforced joy. Before the dinner service began, the event staff quietly removed the 50 empty chairs, erasing the physical reminder of my family's absence. The space was instead filled with brilliant, kind people who knew us deeply. There were industry mentors, loyal friends, and colleagues who valued our characters over our utility. My best friend Elijah gave a toast that made the entire room laugh and cry. Our officiant, Sarah, offered words of immense warmth. We drank vintage champagne, ate incredible food, and danced to a live jazz band. There was no manufactured drama. There were no arrogant, boastful speeches from Julian trying to steal the spotlight. It was entirely peaceful. Late in the evening, as the last of the guests were departing and the catering staff was quietly packing away the silver, Harper and I stood on the wide stone terrace. We looked out over the dark, tranquil expanse of her private lake, completely enveloped in the quiet perfection of our new reality. Harper wrapped her arms around my waist, rested her chin on my chest, and looked up at me. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes searching mine. She was asking about the glaring physical absence of the people who were supposed to love me the most. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders, holding her close, and told her the absolute truth. Their absence is the greatest wedding gift they could have possibly given me, I whispered into the cool night air, because it permanently eradicated any lingering guilt I might have felt for what is inevitably going to happen next. By refusing to drive 2 hours to watch me marry the love of my life simply because they couldn't be bothered, they had finally explicitly shown me exactly where I stood. They had drawn a permanent, uncrossable line in the sand. Harper looked deep into my eyes. Her expression shifted from warm and gentle to fiercely protective and razor-sharp. The corporate titan beneath the bride emerged. "Are you ready for the storm, Joshua?" she asked quietly. I looked at the meticulously manicured grounds of our home, thought about my father on the golf course, and nodded. Let it rain. Exactly 34 days after our wedding, the carefully constructed facade of my brother's perfect life violently collided with the concrete reality of the business world. Julian's tech startup, the company my parents had sacrificed my college fund to supposedly nurture, was failing. It was bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. He was desperately seeking a Series B funding injection to avoid total bankruptcy. More terrifying for him, Isabella was threatening a brutal divorce and a nasty custody battle over the unborn twins if his financial house of cards collapsed. For the past 18 months, Julian had been obsessively trying to secure a pitch meeting with Horizon Ventures. Horizon was one of the most aggressive, highly capitalized technology investment firms on the East Coast. Getting Horizon's backing was the holy grail in his industry. By some miracle of persistent networking by his lower staff, Julian finally secured a pitch meeting. According to the completely detached, clinical account Carter, a senior partner at the firm, gave me later that evening, Julian swaggered into the spectacular glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of the firm's Manhattan headquarters. Julian wore an aggressive, incredibly expensive bespoke suit. He was flanked by his 2 nervous junior assistants, Matthew and Luke. He walked in completely prepared to deliver the presentation that would supposedly save his sinking company. He acted like he already owned the building, smiling his arrogant, manufactured smile, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. He spent the first 10 minutes confidently setting up his slides and attempting to charm Carter. "Carter, great to finally meet you in person," Julian boasted, leaning on the mahogany table. I look forward to showing you how we can make Horizon a lot of money today. Carter sat quietly, hands folded, nodding along politely. Finally, Carter raised a hand to stop him. Julian, the numbers you provided in your preliminary packet are ambitious, Carter said smoothly. But as you know, the final decision for an investment of this magnitude rests solely with our founder and principal managing partner. She has been reviewing your file thoroughly. At the absolute head of the massive boardroom table, a high-backed leather chair was turned away from them, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling New York skyline. She is ready for you now, Carter said, gesturing to the chair. The heavy leather chair slowly, deliberately swiveled around. The quiet woman sitting in it was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit. Her hands were steepled resting on a thick dossier on the desk. She wore an expression of mild, absolute professional boredom. Julian's arrogant smile froze instantly. The color drained from his face with such terrifying, instantaneous speed that Matthew, his assistant, instinctively reached out to grab his arm, assuming his boss was experiencing a sudden cardiac event. Julian's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. The elusive CEO of Horizon Ventures, the legendary financial titan he had been desperately trying to reach for a year and a half, the woman who held the power of financial life and death over his company, was Harper. The same woman he had refused to make eye contact with at Thanksgiving. The same woman his mother called a mundane administrative worker. The same woman his aunt said brought down the family standard. The woman whose wedding he had skipped to go to a golf tournament. Harper did not smile. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a single personal comment. She didn't mention the wedding, the empty chairs, or the blatant disrespect. She remained entirely in her element as a ruthless corporate executioner. She opened the dossier, looked down at the paperwork, and then looked dead into Julian's terrified eyes. "Julian," Harper said, her voice echoing coldly in the massive room. "I have reviewed your proposal. Your user acquisition metrics are heavily inflated. Your burn rate is catastrophic and completely unsustainable. And frankly, your proprietary technology is practically non-existent." Julian tried to stammer out a defense. Harper, Mrs. The projections show. The projections show a sinking ship." Harper cut him off effortlessly. She treated Julian exactly the way she would treat any deeply unqualified, desperate applicant. She delivered a masterclass in professional execution that left him utterly defenseless in front of his own employees. "You lack the leadership and the infrastructure to scale this product," Harper continued, closing the folder with a sharp snap that made Julian flinch. "This is not a viable business. Horizon Ventures will not invest a single dollar of our capital into a fundamentally doomed enterprise. We are passing on this opportunity." Julian's facade crumbled completely. Panic set in. He abandoned his pitch and tried to leverage the only thing he thought he had left. "Harper, please. We're family. Joshua is my brother. You can't do this. If I don't get this funding, the company goes under. Isabella, the house." Harper stopped him with a single, ice-cold look that could have frozen the sun. "This is a boardroom, Julian," she said, her voice carrying absolute, decisive authority. "The only connection that matters in this room is the bottom line. And yours is entirely bankrupt. Carter will see you out." Julian was escorted out of the building by security in a state of catatonic shock. His two assistants followed behind him, heads bowed, realizing their jobs were effectively over. The golden child had just been completely, surgically dismantled by the woman he deemed beneath him. "This is the moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in with me this far. You are amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting number 1 below, so I know you've been with me this far. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey." Exactly 2 hours after Julian was thrown out of the Horizon Ventures lobby, the absolute silence on my end of the phone was finally broken. The barrage began. The 215 calls I mentioned earlier. I sat on my back porch, finishing my coffee, watching the afternoon sun filter through the trees. Finally, on the 14th consecutive call from my mother, I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Joshua!" My mother shrieked the second the line connected. Her voice, usually so composed, carefully modulated, and dripping with practiced condescension, was a shrill, hysterical mess of pure panic. She sounded entirely unhinged. "Mom," I said calmly, taking another sip of my coffee. "Joshua, you have to fix this right now," she cried, completely abandoning any pretense of a polite greeting. "Julian just called us from the city. He is having a full-blown panic attack on the sidewalk outside a building in Manhattan. You have to talk to Harper. You have to make her give him the funding, the promotion, whatever it is he needs. She just destroyed his entire pitch." She was hyperventilating, desperately trying to weave a frantic narrative to save her golden boy. If he loses this company, Isabella will leave him. She will file for divorce. She will demand full custody of the twins. They will lose the house, Joshua. You cannot let your wife do this to your own brother. You have to intervene. She tried to rewrite history in real time. "We love Harper, you know we do. She is family. There was just a terrible misunderstanding about the wedding. We were just so tired. You are a loyal son, Joshua. Talk to her. Fix this." The silence on my end of the line was as heavy and cold as a tombstone. She was entirely, conveniently forgetting that just 5 weeks earlier, she had explicitly told me that I was selfish for expecting them to endure a 2-hour car ride to watch me get married. I let her speak. I let her cry, beg, and manipulate. I let her exhaust herself completely against the impenetrable, steel wall of my silence. When she finally stopped to take a breath, sobbing dramatically into the receiver, I spoke. My voice was profoundly calm, detached, and carrying a weight I had never possessed before. It sounded like a stranger to my own ears. "My family," I said slowly, emphasizing every single syllable so it hung heavily in the digital space between us, "consists of my wife and the people who actually showed up to celebrate our union." My mother gasped, trying to interrupt. "Joshua, please, you don't mean that. You made it abundantly clear," I continued, my voice cutting through her tears like a knife, "that a 2-hour drive was simply too exhausting a journey to support me. You chose to post pictures at a golf tournament while I stood at the altar." I paused, letting the crushing weight of reality set in for her. "So, I am absolutely certain you will understand that walking 10 steps down the hall to my wife's home office to ask her to compromise her billion-dollar firm for a man who couldn't even RSVP to our wedding is simply too taxing on my energy. My back is acting up." "You can't do this," she screamed, the fake sweetness vanishing, replaced by vicious panic. "If Julian goes bankrupt, we will have to hire a lawyer to save his house. We will have to empty our retirement accounts to pay his debts. You owe us, Joshua." "I owe you nothing," I replied softly. "You spent my college fund on his car. I paid my own way. And as for your travel issues, I suggest you call Uncle Aaron. I hear his new SUV runs great." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I didn't wait for her to scream again. I pressed the red button. Immediately, I went into my phone settings. I blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Julian, Aunt Susan, and Uncle Aaron. I systematically and ruthlessly severed every single digital and social tie connecting me to the people who had raised me, finalizing the boundary that they themselves had initiated. I placed the phone face down on the wooden table. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and took a deep, long breath of fresh air. The storm they had created finally broke, leaving behind nothing but clear skies. 3 entire months passed since the day I pressed the red button on my phone and severed the digital cord connecting me to the people who raised me. 90 days of absolute, uninterrupted, golden silence. For the first time in my entire 32 years of existence, my phone did not ring with a manufactured crisis. There were no passive-aggressive text messages from my mother complaining about my lack of ambition. There were no mandatory Sunday dinners where I had to sit at the far end of the dining table, chewing dry roast beef, while I listened to my father brag endlessly about Julian's imaginary corporate empire. My life with Harper settled into a rhythm of profound, beautiful, and healing tranquility. I went to work. I poured my energy into my own career. I came home to the woman I deeply loved, and we built our future without a single dark cloud of familial obligation hanging over our heads. But just because I had blocked their numbers and locked them out of my daily reality did not mean the world stopped spinning on their side of the fence. The natural consequences of my family's supreme arrogance, their financial recklessness, and their cruelty were playing out exactly as Harper had predicted in that Manhattan boardroom. I didn't need to unblock their numbers or check their social media to know what was happening. My best friend Elijah, whose mother still lived exactly 3 doors down from my parents in the New Jersey suburbs, served as a completely willing and highly entertained informant. Elijah had watched them treat me like an afterthought for 20 years, and he felt absolutely zero guilt about watching their house of cards collapse. He would occasionally come over for a beer on the weekend, sit on my back porch, and give me the updates I never explicitly asked for, but quietly needed to hear to validate the permanence of my decision. The fallout was spectacular, total, and entirely irreversible. Exactly 3 weeks after Harper surgically and ruthlessly dismantled Julian's desperate pitch at Horizon Ventures, the Golden Boys tech startup officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The inflated user acquisition metrics and the catastrophic burn rate that Harper had pointed out in the boardroom were not just minor red flags. They were the absolute nail in the coffin. When the news hit the industry grapevine that Horizon Ventures had aggressively and permanently passed on the investment, the other, smaller venture capital firms scattered like roaches when the kitchen light turns on. No one wanted to touch Julian's company. He was marked as toxic. The creditors began circling immediately, relentlessly demanding repayment on the massive, high-interest loans he had arrogantly taken out to fund his custom linen suits, his lavish office space, and his leased luxury cars. The company's bank accounts were frozen. The employees were locked out of the building. But the business failing was only the first domino to fall. The real devastation, the true catastrophic collapse, happened inside the walls of his own home. Isabella, the woman who had demanded my parents fly across the country and spend thousands of dollars for a lavish gender reveal party on a Malibu beach, did not handle financial ruin with grace. She was a woman who had married a projection of wealth, not the man himself. The moment the company accounts were frozen and the silver leased Mercedes was physically repossessed from their driveway in the middle of the night, the facade of their perfect, magazine cover marriage shattered completely. According to Elijah, who heard it from his mother, the screaming matches in their large house were so violently loud that the neighbors threatened to call the police on multiple occasions. Isabella did not just pack her designer bags and leave quietly. She filed for a brutal, highly publicized, and incredibly vicious divorce. She immediately hired the most ruthless, expensive divorce lawyer in the entire county, a man known for leaving opposing spouses with absolutely nothing. She demanded full physical and legal custody of the unborn twins, claiming Julian was financially unstable, emotionally erratic, and a complete fraud. She wanted massive child support, she wanted permanent alimony, and she wanted the house even though the mortgage was severely underwater. The fairy tale was dead, replaced by a vicious legal bloodbath that consumed Julian's every waking hour. This is exactly where my parents made their final, fatal miscalculation. Instead of letting Julian face the consequences of his own disastrous business decisions, instead of letting him learn how to stand on his own 2 feet for the first time in his 34 years of life, my mother and father swooped in to save the golden child. They simply could not tolerate the public humiliation of their favorite son, their ultimate trophy, losing everything. They needed to maintain the illusion of success for their superficial country club friends. My parents systematically drained their entire retirement savings. They liquidated mutual funds, they sold off blue-chip stocks at a massive penalty, and they completely wiped out the money they had spent 40 grueling years accumulating. When that staggering amount of cash wasn't enough to cover Julian's massive corporate debts, the creditor settlements, and his mounting legal fees for the custody battle, they did the unthinkable. They took out a massive second mortgage on the large New Jersey home I grew up in. They literally sacrificed their own financial security, their peaceful golden years, and whatever meager inheritance might have been left for their grandchildren, to bail out a grown man who refused to take a regular job. The severe financial strain broke them completely. The performative wealth vanished overnight. My father had to quietly and humiliatingly cancel his exclusive country club membership. He could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly dues or the weekend golf tournaments, the exact same tournaments he had chosen over attending my wedding. My mother abruptly stopped hosting her lavish dinner parties. She stopped bragging to the neighbors over the fence. The designer pastel outfits she loved to wear were replaced by a deep, suffocating, and constant anxiety. The extended family, the aunts and uncles who had so quickly and easily abandoned me to follow the money and the status, suddenly found themselves backing a completely losing horse. Uncle Aaron, the man with the brand new SUV who claimed vague car trouble to avoid my wedding, actually had the sheer audacity to ask my father for a short-term loan to put a down payment on a vacation home. When my father tearfully admitted they were completely broke, living paycheck to paycheck because of Julian's legal fees, the family turned on each other like starving wolves. Aunt Susan stopped calling my mother. The active family group chats went completely dead. The entire family structure, which was built purely on the fragile illusion of wealth and conditional status, collapsed under the crushing weight of reality. They had traded their loyal, quiet son for a golden goose that turned out to be made of heavy, worthless lead. And now, they were drowning in the dark ocean of their own making. The absolute climax of their desperation, the moment the universe delivered the final, undeniable verdict on their choices, happened exactly 4 months after the wedding. It was a bitterly cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October. The vibrant green leaves on the ancient trees surrounding our 70-acre private estate had turned to deep, dying shades of orange and brown. The sky was a heavy, unbroken blanket of dark gray clouds, relentlessly pouring freezing rain onto the asphalt. Harper and I were driving back from the city. I had just received a massive promotion at my firm, stepping into a senior director role that came with a significant bump in my salary and immense creative control over my department. It was a career milestone I had achieved entirely on my own merit, through years of quiet, dedicated hard work. My mind was clear, my energy was laser-focused, and my professional life was absolutely thriving because I was no longer carrying the dead weight of my family's constant, suffocating disapproval. Harper had insisted we leave the office early to celebrate with a quiet, expensive dinner near our home. We were driving down the winding, heavily forested road that led to the private, secure entrance of our estate. Harper was behind the wheel of her jet-black Porsche 911, the wide tires gripping the wet, slick asphalt smoothly. The powerful heater was on, soft, rhythmic jazz was playing over the high-end speakers, and the world inside the leather-lined cabin of the sports car was warm, dry, and completely secure. As we approached the massive, 12-foot-high wrought iron security gates that guarded the entrance to our property, the Porsche naturally began to slow down. Normally, the advanced automated system would instantly read the secure digital tag on the windshield, and the heavy gates would swing open smoothly before we even had to touch the brakes. But today they remained firmly, stubbornly shut. Standing in the freezing, pouring rain, completely drenched from head to toe, violently banging his bare fists against the heavy, unyielding iron bars, was my older brother Julian. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, custom suit-wearing CEO who had swaggered into the Horizon Ventures boardroom just a few months prior. His expensive haircut was ruined, his hair plastered flat to his forehead by the rain. His clothes, a cheap, ill-fitting windbreaker and stained jeans, were wrinkled and soaked completely through to his skin. He looked frantic, manic, and totally desperate. His leased luxury Mercedes was long gone, replaced by a battered, economy rental sedan that was idling haphazardly on the muddy shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting weakly through the downpour. He had driven 2.5 agonizing hours through a torrential autumn storm to get here. The exact same drive, the exact same distance, that my parents had claimed was simply too physically taxing to make for my wedding day. But now that Julian was facing total bankruptcy, a nasty, humiliating divorce, and the imminent loss of his home, he had miraculously found the energy to make the trip. He was standing at the stainless steel intercom call box, screaming into the speaker at Marcus, our massive head of security, demanding to be let onto the property. Harper brought the Porsche to a complete, smooth stop about 20 feet from the iron gate. The bright LED headlights of the car cut through the heavy sheet of rain, brightly illuminating Julian's desperate, shivering figure. Julian turned around, squinting aggressively against the blinding lights of the sports car. When he finally recognized the sleek, unmistakable profile of the Porsche, the exact same car he had undoubtedly heard whispers about from the venture capital circles after his humiliating defeat, he literally ran toward it. He didn't know I was sitting comfortably in the passenger seat. He only knew this car belonged to the ruthless CEO of Horizon Ventures. He only knew this was his absolute, final, desperate lifeline to avoid complete ruin. He slapped his wet, freezing hands against the passenger side window, right next to my face. The glass was heavily tinted and completely soundproofed, so he couldn't see me clearly, but I could see him with perfect, terrifying clarity. I could see the bloodshot veins in his eyes, the raw panic pulling at the corners of his mouth, the complete, utter destruction of his monumental ego. "Harper, please!" he screamed, his voice distorted and muffled by the thick, reinforced glass and the relentless pounding of the rain. "Please, you have to let me in. We need to talk. You have to help me. My parents are losing their house. Isabella took the kids. I have no money for the lawyer. Your family. Joshua is my brother. Please, just open the gate." He was begging. The golden child, the man who had treated me like absolute dirt on the bottom of his expensive Italian shoes for 3 full decades, the man who couldn't be bothered to check a box on an RSVP card to my wedding, was now begging on his hands and knees in the freezing mud outside my heavily fortified gates. I looked at him. I waited for a reaction within myself. I waited for the anger to rise. I waited for the guilt to twist in my stomach. But I felt absolutely nothing. I felt my heart beat steadily, calmly in my chest. There was no sudden spike of adrenaline. There was no overwhelming urge to roll down the window and scream at him. There was no petty desire to rub his massive failure in his face. I simply looked at him as if he were a complete stranger asking for complicated directions in a language I did not speak. I slowly turned my head and looked at Harper. She had both hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel. Her posture was completely relaxed. She didn't look angry, she didn't look vindictive, and she certainly didn't look sympathetic. She just looked mildly inconvenienced, like a driver waiting for a stray animal to cross the road. She glanced over at me, her eyebrows raised in a silent, powerful question. She was giving me the ultimate choice. If I wanted to open the window, if I wanted to gloat, or if I wanted to miraculously let him in and save him, she would support me without hesitation. I shook my head slowly, deliberately. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers on the center console. "Drive," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. Harper gave a small, firm nod. She reached up and pressed a button on the ceiling console. The massive iron gates slowly began to swing inward, the motors humming quietly over the sound of the storm. Julian stepped back, a look of wild, desperate hope flashing across his wet, pathetic face. He actually thought he had broken through. He thought the magic, manipulative word family had worked one last time to save his skin. Harper shifted the Porsche smoothly into gear. The powerful engine growled low and deep. She didn't roll down the window. She didn't even look at him. She simply accelerated, gliding the sleek black car smoothly and effortlessly through the open gates, passing mere inches from where he stood in the mud. Through the heated side mirror, I watched Julian turn around, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He took a stumbling step forward to follow us onto the property. But Marcus, the massive security guard, stepped out of the illuminated guardhouse and held up a firm, uncompromising, massive hand. The heavy iron gates instantly reversed direction, swinging shut with a loud, final, echoing metallic clang, locking Julian out in the cold, freezing rain forever. We drove up the winding, perfectly paved driveway toward the warm, glowing lights of our home. We didn't speak about him for the rest of the evening. The golden child was finally, permanently, just a ghost in the rearview mirror. Society relentlessly conditions us from a very young, vulnerable age to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are taught, through movies, books, and unsolicited advice from relatives, to forgive the absolutely unforgivable. We are pressured to endure the unbearable, and to constantly, repeatedly lower our personal boundaries simply because we share a last name with our abusers. We are forcefully told that family is a lifelong, unbreakable commitment, a sacred bond that must be preserved at all costs, even if the actual cost is our own mental health, our own financial stability, and our own fundamental self-worth. I spent the first 32 years of my life deeply, miserably trapped in that exact psychological prison. I constantly contorted my personality to fit their needs. I minimized my academic and professional achievements to avoid casting a shadow on Julian. I completely silenced my own needs and desires to avoid disrupting the manufactured, delicate hierarchy of my parents' home. I accepted the absolute bare minimum of affection and called it love. I allowed them to casually steal my college fund, money I had worked night shifts in a greasy diner to save, just to buy a luxury car for my brother so he could look impressive. I allowed them to openly insult the woman I loved, mocking her salary and her clothes. I allowed them to skip the most important day of my life, leaving 50 wooden chairs empty, for a casual game of golf. I did all of this, I endured all of this because I was terrified of being the bad guy. I was terrified of being the one to break the family apart. But what I didn't realize back then in the dark, and what I understand with brilliant crystal clarity now, is that the family was already broken. It was never whole. It was never a place of safety or unconditional support. It was a cold, calculated transaction. It was a long-running stage play where Julian was always the lead actor. My parents were the demanding directors, and I was just a convenient prop they used whenever they needed someone to stand quietly in the background and make them look good by comparison. Building your own beautiful castle in the light requires you to violently and permanently stop inviting people who only know how to operate in the dark. In the years following that rainy, pathetic afternoon at the security gate, my life expanded in ways I never thought possible. The major promotion I received was just the very beginning of my ascent. Without the constant, draining background noise of my mother's emotional manipulation, without the anxiety of my brother's manufactured financial crises weighing me down, my mind was finally free to innovate and dream. I started an independent consulting firm on the side, utilizing my years of quiet, unappreciated industry experience. Within 2 short years, it grew so wildly successful that I left my corporate job entirely. I became my own boss. I built my own wealth, completely independent of Harper's massive billion-dollar empire. We were true equals, partners in every sense of the word, operating on an unshakable foundation of mutual respect, transparency, and absolute loyalty. I never heard from my parents again. I had effectively attended the funeral of our family dynamic the day I blocked their numbers, and I had no desire to visit the grave. They never met the 2 beautiful children Harper and I eventually welcomed into the world. I learned through the neighborhood grapevine, mostly through Elijah's mother, who still loves to monitor the suburban gossip, that my parents eventually lost the fight to save their status. They had to sell the sprawling New Jersey house to pay off the final remnants of Julian's staggering legal debts. They moved into a small, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment 2 towns over, entirely stripped of their performative country club wealth. Julian's bitter divorce was finalized, leaving him with joint custody of the twins that he barely utilized because he couldn't afford a place big enough for them to stay. He was burdened with a mountain of debt he could never repay in his lifetime. The man who wore custom linen suits and demanded venture capital funding ended up taking a low-level, entry-level sales job just to afford his basic rent and groceries. The people who thought they were absolute royalty ended up living the exact mundane, struggling, invisible life they used to mock me for having. I don't say this to gloat. I don't take pleasure in their suffering. I say this because it is the undeniable, objective reality of karma. When people explicitly show you that their love is conditional, transactional, and entirely dependent on what you can do to elevate their public image, you must believe them the very first time. You must give yourself the profound, liberating permission to stop auditioning for a role they never, ever intended to cast you in. You do not owe your current success to the people who completely ignored you when you were struggling in the dark. You do not owe your hard-earned wealth to the people who drained your resources and stole your college fund. And you absolutely, categorically do not owe them a seat at the table once you have built your own beautiful, peaceful life in the light. There is a very specific, unique kind of grief that comes with cutting off your family. It is mourning the idea of the supportive parents you deserved, rather than the toxic parents you actually had. But once that specific grief passes, what remains in its wake is an impenetrable shield of self-respect. I learned that true family is not defined by biology or a shared last name. True family is defined by the people who show up for you when there is absolutely nothing in it for them. True family is Harper standing next to me at the altar, looking at 50 empty chairs without blinking, and promising to be my partner in the storm. True family is my friend Elijah taking time off work to stand by my side and tell the truth. We are not obligated to carry the heavy, toxic baggage of our ancestors simply because we share DNA. We are allowed to put the heavy bags down on the side of the road. We are allowed to walk away without looking back. And most importantly, we are allowed to lock the heavy iron gate behind us. It has been exactly 5 years since the wedding. 5 long, beautiful years since the phones detonated with their manufactured panic. 5 years since the heavy iron gates closed on the past forever. This evening, I am sitting exactly where I belong in the universe. The sun is beginning to set over the jagged peaks of the Pocono Mountains, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the completely still surface of our private lake. The sky is painted in deep, breathtaking shades of purple, crimson, and gold, reflecting perfectly on the water. The air is incredibly crisp and clean, smelling strongly of ancient pine needles, damp earth, and fresh water. I am sitting in a deep, comfortable chair on the wide, sweeping stone terrace of our home. There is a heavy ceramic cup of hot Earl Grey tea resting on the small wrought iron table next to me, steam curling lazily into the cool evening air. The massive 70-acre estate is entirely, blissfully quiet, save for the gentle, rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the wooden dock in the distance, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the willow trees. Harper walks out onto the terrace through the large glass doors. She is wearing a simple, soft gray cashmere sweater and comfortable, faded jeans. Her hair is pulled back loosely. She doesn't look like a ruthless corporate titan right now. She doesn't look like the woman who destroyed my brother's company with a single sentence. She just looks like my wife. She walks over softly, slides into the chair right next to mine, and hands me a small plate of warm, chocolate chip cookies she just pulled from the oven. She smiles, a genuine, completely relaxed smile, leaning over to rest her head gently on my shoulder. I wrap my arm around her, pulling her close against the evening chill. We sit together in comfortable, absolute silence, watching the sun slowly dip below the tree line, plunging the valley into a soft, peaceful twilight. I search my heart, and I find that I feel absolutely no anger anymore. I feel no lingering resentment toward the people living in that cramped apartment in New Jersey. I don't wonder what my father is doing, or if my mother is still trying to manipulate her new neighbors. I don't care about Julian's miserable career trajectory or his bitter divorce. They belong to a past life, a different, darker dimension that can no longer touch me, hurt me, or demand anything from me. The final, decisive severing of that emotional chain was the greatest, most profound act of self-care I could have ever performed for myself and my future family. My greatest revenge was not the dramatic boardroom confrontation where Harper humiliated him. It wasn't the cold refusal at the security gate in the pouring rain. My greatest revenge, the ultimate victory, is this exact, quiet moment. It is absolute, unbothered, impenetrable peace. It is a peace achieved by quietly stepping out of their toxic, chaotic narrative and allowing the natural, unavoidable consequences of their own supreme arrogance to completely and utterly dismantle them, while I sit quietly on my porch, drinking hot tea, holding my wife, and watching the sunset over a life they will never, ever be a part of. I built my castle in the light, and the walls are strong enough to keep the shadows out forever. Listen, if you have made it this far into my story, if you have stayed with me through the empty chairs and the locked gates, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. This isn't just a dramatic story about a ruined business or a skipped wedding. It is a story about the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of setting boundaries in your own life. Many of us carry the heavy, suffocating, completely unearned guilt of wanting to distance ourselves from toxic family members or abusive friends. We are told by society that we are being difficult, that we are being selfish, or that we are being unforgiving. But the ultimate lesson I learned, at the high cost of my own early happiness, is that protecting your peace is not a crime. It is a fundamental, absolute human right. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you in the first place. You cannot grow, you cannot thrive, and you cannot find your own light while being anchored to people who demand you stay small, quiet, and miserable just so they can feel big and important. Setting a boundary, even a permanent one, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of supreme self-respect and self-preservation. When you finally decide to stop pouring your precious time, your money, and your emotional energy into a bottomless pit of familial obligation that gives nothing back, you will be absolutely amazed at the beautiful, successful, and deeply peaceful life you can build with that reclaimed energy. Let go of the guilt. It does not belong to you. Walk away from the empty chairs in your life and start building your own table. What is the most important lesson you took away from my experience? Is there a difficult boundary you know you need to set in your own life right now, whether it's with a parent, a sibling, or a partner? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts and your own stories with me in the comments below. Let's build a community of people who refuse to be treated as options. Or, if my story simply resonated with you today, and you agree that protecting your peace comes before absolutely everything else, just drop the word "good" in the comments so I know you are standing with me in the light. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time, and always remember, you hold the keys to your own gates.